So this question really is quite an interesting question, and probably a very good question to do if you get this in the exam. And it's really because it gives you a lot of scope to talk about different things, different various topics within government. So, to what extent was England's government fundamentally transformed in the years 1509 to 1547? Okay, so I'm underlining fundamentally transformed, and then the 2 years, so 1509 to 1547. The first thing that should be coming into your head straight away is 1509 to 1547. Well, 1509 to 1547 is the reign of Henry VIII. So, reign of Henry VIII. So you wouldn't get any credit for talking about anything else other than really just Henry VIII, okay? And there are a lot of different ways which you can argue for and against this question, okay? So, first of all, you can take a fundamentally a positive view on this question and say it was fundamentally transformed, and we're going to get into a little bit of evidence later on. You could take the opposite. You could say it wasn't fundamentally transformed. You could take issue with the language in the question. You could say that although it was transformed, although there was transformation, to suggest it was fundamentally transformed may be a little bit careless, a bit of an oversight. Okay, now that's the sort of way I think I would have answered this question. You would have just, instead of arguing one side or the other, you could probably argue that although there was transformation within the years, to suggest that this was fundamentally transformed, suggest that there was a whole transformation in the sort of fundamentals of government would probably be inaccurate. So what you're really arguing there is suggesting that you agree to an extent that there was transformation, but not to the extent that the question is asking. That's one way of looking at it. And I think taking the sort of neutral approach and arguing slightly for one side, but not fully for one side, is probably the best way of looking at it. Since this is a question that's asking about the entire government of Henry VIII, there's a lot of pros and cons, and there's a lot of continuity and change that happened in those years. And so it's really difficult to argue truly for one side or the other. So with that being said, we're going to look at how you can structure this essay, how you can sort of split it up. So generally we have an introduction, like normal, and the introduction should contain your an outline of what you're going to argue, what I would call your initial conclusion. Your initial conclusion. Okay? And this is really one of the things that separates GCSE from A-level is what you have to do is you have to, in the introduction, outline the sort of arguments on both sides, explain where you're going to argue, how you're going to argue this. So in this essay, it's more convincing to suggest this or that or whatever. And then if you have time, write what you're going to say. So write how you're going to argue. We're going to, are you going to look at it from 3 different topics or 3 different time periods? And, just really outline how your essay is structured. And then we get into the actual essay. Now, generally, it's probably best to always have around 3 paragraphs. 2 isn't really enough, and 4 or 5 is probably too many. Okay, so around 3 paragraphs. And if you want to do really good paragraphs with lots of detail and lots of arguments from both sides, then you probably only have time to do 3 anyway. Okay. Now, it's interesting how you can split this up. Now, with A-level history, it's it's very rare that you get a question that's so broad like this. You're being asked about government, and you're being asked about government within a huge time span. You're asking about government from 1509 to 1547, a very long period of time. Okay, so what we can do is you can split your paragraphs into 3. Okay, so you can maybe have paragraph 1 talking about the different things that happened in government between 1509 and say 1520, for example. If you know your history really well, you can split it up like this. Okay, paragraph 2 could be 1520 to maybe 1530. Okay, in the middle period, and then paragraph 3 can be 1530 to 1547. For example, this is all examples, okay? You can obviously change the goalpost in terms of the time period as much as you want there. That's fine. But what I'm trying to say is, you can, rather than talking about 3 different things in each paragraph, you can split it into 3 different times, okay? And talk about everything from 1509 to 1520 in terms of the transformation, and then from 1520 to 1530, then 1530 to 1547. That's one way we can look at it. We can also do it a different way, which is probably seen as the more traditional way of doing it, which is you have paragraph 1, and say paragraph 1, you can talk about Henry VIII's ministers. So Henry VIII's ministers. Okay, and then maybe paragraph 2, you can talk about Parliament, and then say paragraph 3, you can talk about maybe local government. And really, the thing about this is, it's going to take practice for you to work out which method of writing these essays is best for each question. I'd personally argue that it's probably easier to do this method than this method, because you can talk a lot about Henry VIII's ministers. You can talk about Wolsey, you can talk about Cromwell, you can talk about all kinds of things. Okay, you can talk a little bit more, you can talk a little bit about Parliament, okay, and the relations with Parliament, and you can talk a little bit about local government. But if there's probably more on the first paragraph than there are on the other 2. So you're going to have quite a lopsided essay where you talk quite a lot about this, and then you're sort of struggling for information here, okay? And especially if your knowledge of local government probably isn't that good, for example, then you might struggle. Whereas in this, you can talk about ministers, Parliament, local government within each time period, okay? So these are really 2 ways you can do it. If you want to know how we structure, the best way in my opinion, the best way of structuring these paragraphs, watch my video, a video that was done recently on our channel about the sort of how to answer essay questions for A-level history. Very recently, I'll link it down below in the description to this video. So I won't go into it in any more detail there, but let's look at the actual specific question that we have here and what we can do. I'm going to just generally, and what I might do, I might just have 2 sides of the argument. England's government was fundamentally transformed. England's government was not fundamentally transformed. Okay, so England's government was fundamentally transformed. And I have a look at the evidence here. Fundamentally transformed. What evidence do we have for this proposition? Well, it's quite a lot, really. So the role of the nobility as personal advisors to the king was undermined by the appointment of Wolsey and Cromwell. So we have appointment of Wolsey and Cromwell. Appointments of Wolsey and Cromwell. It undermined the the role the nobility had. So undermine the nobility. Undermined the nobility. Because don't forget, Wolsey and Cromwell weren't traditional nobles. Wolsey came from quite a lower class background, and Henry VIII devolved pretty much all of his power to Wolsey and Cromwell so that they can run the country on his behalf, and they were his sole ministers. Whereas before, with Henry VII, for example, Henry relied a little bit more on the nobility and other people, more local, more central councils to run England rather than two individual people. Okay. When it comes to Parliament, you can talk about the Reformation Parliament. Okay, the Reformation Parliament, the sort of role Parliament played in the King's Great Matter. Okay, so you can bring up the King's Great Matter in this section, King's Great Matter. And then when it comes to local government, you can talk about local councils being given more authority. So, for example, you can talk about the Council of the North. Council of the North, okay? And the authority that these places had, and the local councils. So, definitely an argument for a transformation, but was it an argument for fundamental transformation? Transformation to the fundamental workings of government? Well, maybe, because you could say Wolsey and Cromwell definitely transformed the way government was run and the power that Parliament and the local councils were given. So what's the arguments that England's government was not transformed? So what evidence do we have for this proposition here? Oh, that's very poor. I'll pretend that didn't happen. Okay. So you could argue really that whilst Parliament was given more authority and was transformed with this sort of Reformation Parliament, Parliament still had relied on the King's authority. Parliament still relied... Oopsie daisy. What's happening? There we go. Still relied on Henry's authority. Which was important because the argument in the question is, was it fundamentally transformed? Well, there was definitely transformation within Parliament, within the role Parliament had, but the fundamentals of Parliament, it still relied on the King's authority. So you can't really argue that it was a fundamental transformation. Okay? And then we can also talk about the return of the Privy Council. So return of the Privy Council, which was around the 1540s. So towards the end of Henry VIII's reign, we see a return to the Privy Council, which is also an argument for the taking up this idea. Because don't forget, within the early times of Henry VIII's reign, Wolsey and Cromwell didn't really have any power at all. It was the Privy Council. There was a Privy Council style of government. So there wasn't really transformation there. And then it was within the 20s and the 30s, within maybe even further, the 20s, 30s, and all the way up to the 40s, when Henry relied on Wolsey and Cromwell to deal with the King's Great Matter. That was when the Privy Council came out of focus, and then it came back again later on in the 40s, between 40 and 47. So you can definitely look at the different popularities of the Privy Council from period to period. Okay. If we go back down here, so we've got the return of the Privy Council, and we still have a Privy Chamber. So Privy Chamber, and there is still within the Privy Chamber there was still nobility, and this nobility still had power. Okay, nobility still had power. So again, it goes against what we've written up here about the undermining of the nobility through Wolsey and Cromwell. You could say, well, yes, on one side that is true. However, the argument is that although Wolsey and Cromwell did undermine the nobility, it's not accurate to say that the nobility had no power. They still had power within government. So the idea that there was a fundamental transformation doesn't seem to hold much water, because although there was transformation, there was a little bit of transformation in the years of Henry VIII, there was still the fundamental aspects of government, the idea of Parliament and the idea of the nobility was still there. So that's really a very good way of arguing it. And this is some of the evidence that you can use. So in other videos, we're going to just look again at more of these questions, and then we're going to look at how we structure them as well. And I urge you all to practice by planning this question yourself, writing it out, and maybe marking it yourself or getting someone to mark it for you, and just getting better and better and better at writing essays. And this is the best way of doing it.